The evening sun dipped below the city skyline, casting a golden glow over the streets, as Karoline Leavitt settled into the back seat of a sleek black sedan. It had been another long day filled with meetings, interviews, and public appearances. The exhaustion weighed on her, but she was used to it by now. Her driver, Daniel, a man in his early 50s with neatly combed hair and a quiet demeanor, kept his eyes on the road. He had been assigned to her a few days ago, and while he was always professional, Karoline had noticed something about him. There was a tiredness in the way he carried himself, a kind of exhaustion that went beyond a long work shift. His uniform was clean but worn at the edges. His hands gripped the steering wheel just a little too tightly, and despite the warmth inside the car, he kept his faded jacket zipped up to the collar, as if the cold had settled deep into his bones. Karoline watched him for a moment before breaking the silence. "Long day." Daniel glanced at her in the rearview mirror and offered a polite but tight-lipped smile. "Yeah, but work is work. Gotta keep moving." There was something in the way he said it that made Karoline pause. She had met many people in her line of work, and she had learned how to recognize the weight of unspoken struggles. But she let it go for now, giving him space. As they pulled up to the evening's venue, she reached for the door handle, but just as she stepped out, she caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. Thinking she was gone, Daniel reached into the back seat and grabbed a thin, frayed blanket. He wrapped it around himself before leaning back in the driver's seat, staring out at the street with a quiet stillness. Karoline hesitated. She stood outside the car for a moment, adjusting her coat, her mind racing. It wasn't just the blanket. It was the way he curled into it, the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was watching. She walked into the event, her usual smile in place, shaking hands and posing for pictures. But even as she engaged in conversation, her mind kept drifting back to the man sitting alone in the car, wrapped in that thin blanket. By the time the event ended, Karoline had made a decision. When she stepped outside, Daniel sat up straight, folding the blanket quickly as if trying to hide it. He reached for the door handle, ready to do his job, but Karoline hesitated before getting in. "You okay?" she asked as she slid into the back seat. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Just a bit chilly tonight," he said with a forced smile. But Karoline wasn't convinced. As they drove through the quiet city streets, she studied him carefully. The silence in the car felt heavier than before, and for the first time she noticed the deep lines around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched just slightly as if he was carrying something too heavy to put into words. She leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel met her gaze in the mirror, his posture still composed. "Of course, Miss Leavitt." "Call me Karoline," she said gently. "And I don't know. I feel like there's more to your story than you're letting on." Daniel's fingers flexed around the steering wheel. He inhaled, as if deciding how much to say, then exhaled slowly. "It's been a rough year," he admitted, his voice steady but low. "Lost my wife last spring. The medical bills, they took everything. My savings, my home. My daughter's staying with relatives until I can get back on my feet." Karoline felt her chest tighten. "I've been living in my car," Daniel continued, his tone calm, as if he had come to terms with it. "It's not ideal, but it's temporary. At least I've got a job. A lot of people don't even have that." There was no trace of self-pity in his voice, only quiet resilience. Karoline's throat tightened. She had spent the day surrounded by luxury, stepping in and out of places most people never had access to, while the man driving her from one event to another was sleeping in his car. She folded her hands in her lap. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Daniel shrugged, his eyes still fixed on the road. "Everyone's got their own struggles. I don't want to be a burden." Karoline sat back, her mind racing. This wasn't something she could ignore. As they pulled up to her hotel, she made a quiet decision. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't just let this go. That night, Karoline sat in her hotel room, staring out at the city lights. The words Daniel had spoken echoed in her mind. Lost my wife. Medical bills took everything. My daughter's staying with relatives until I get back on my feet. She could still picture the way he gripped the steering wheel, the way he had carefully folded that thin, worn blanket as if it was the only thing keeping him together. This wasn't just about hardship. This was about dignity. Daniel wasn't asking for help. He wasn't complaining. He was doing what he had to do, working, surviving, pushing forward. And that made Karoline want to help him even more. She reached for her phone and made a call. "Hey, I need a favor," she said, her voice steady. "I need to find someone a place to stay tonight. And I need something else too." The next morning, when Daniel pulled up to the hotel, Karoline was already waiting outside. She slipped into the back seat as usual, but this time her expression was different. Calm. Determined. As they drove through the city, she spoke casually. "I have a meeting later, but before that, I'd love to grab a quick coffee. Do you have time?" Daniel glanced at her through the rearview mirror, clearly surprised. Sure. I guess." "Great," she said with a smile. 10 minutes later, they pulled up to a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Karoline gestured toward the parking lot. "Come in with me?" Daniel hesitated. He had never been invited anywhere by a client before. "I'll buy," she added, grinning. "I insist." Still unsure, Daniel nodded and followed her inside. They ordered their drinks, and Karoline led him to a quiet corner table. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel took a sip of his coffee, his fingers wrapped around the cup as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "Sure." She leaned forward slightly. "What did you do before driving?" A flicker of something crossed his face, nostalgia, maybe even sadness. "I had a repair shop," he said finally. "Auto repairs. Small place, but it was mine. I built it from the ground up." Karoline nodded. "And you loved it?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, I did." She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table toward him. Daniel frowned. "What's this?" Karoline's voice was steady. "A fresh start." He hesitated before opening it. Inside was a rental agreement for a fully furnished apartment paid for an entire year. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he read the papers. "Karoline, I can't." "You can," she said gently. "And you will." His throat tightened. "This is too much." Karoline shook her head. "You've spent your life taking care of others. Now it's time someone took care of you." Daniel swallowed hard. He had never been given anything like this before. But before he could protest again, Karoline spoke. "There's more," she said, reaching into her bag once more. She pulled out a business card and placed it on top of the papers. "It's the number of someone who owns a repair shop. He's looking for someone with experience." Daniel blinked, staring at the card as if he wasn't sure it was real. "A job?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A real one," she confirmed. "Not just something to get by. Something to build on." He exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know what to say." Karoline smiled. "Say yes." Daniel sat there for a long time, staring at the papers in front of him. He had spent so long just trying to survive that the idea of actually living again felt foreign. Finally, he met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something different in his eyes. Hope. He nodded slowly. "Okay." A breath of relief washed over Karoline. "Good." She raised her coffee cup. "To new beginnings?" Daniel hesitated, then lifted his own cup. "To new beginnings!" As they clinked their cups together, the weight on his shoulders seemed just a little lighter. For the first time in a long time, Daniel wasn't just surviving. He was starting over. That evening, Daniel sat in his new apartment, still trying to process everything that had happened. The keys rested on the table in front of him, the lease agreement neatly folded beside them. He had walked through every inch of the space, running his hands along the kitchen counters, the soft fabric of the couch, even the fresh sheets on the neatly made bed. For months, he had been sleeping in his car, telling himself it was only temporary. But deep down, a part of him had begun to wonder if he would ever truly get back on his feet. Now, for the first time in a long time, he had a door that locked, a roof over his head, a place to call home. He picked up the business card Karoline had given him and ran his thumb over the embossed letters. A job. A real job. The thought of stepping back into a repair shop, of doing something he loved again, sent a rush of emotions through him: excitement, fear, disbelief. Just then, his phone buzzed. He hesitated before picking it up. Karoline, settling in okay? Daniel exhaled, shaking his head with a small, disbelieving smile. He typed back, Daniel, still feels unreal. A few seconds later, the dots appeared as she typed, Karoline, good. Means it's just the beginning. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down. For the first time in over a year, he wasn't thinking about where he would sleep tonight. He wasn't wondering how he would make it through another week. He wasn't just surviving. He was living. The next morning, Daniel woke up in an actual bed, stretching his arms and feeling the unfamiliar comfort of soft sheets beneath him. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the reality settle in. Then, with a deep breath, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, got dressed, and picked up the business card. It was time to take the next step. By noon, he was standing outside the repair shop, his palms slightly sweaty as he stared at the sign above the door. He hadn't walked into a place like this in years. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. A man in his 60s, wearing a grease-stained work shirt, looked up from behind the counter. You must be Daniel, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Karoline told me you'd be coming. Daniel nodded. Yes, sir. The man gestured toward the open garage, where a few cars sat on lifts. Well, let's see what you can do. Daniel glanced around the shop, the familiar scent of motor oil and metal filling his senses. He took another breath, then walked forward, rolling up his sleeves. Within minutes, he was lost in the work, his hands moving over the engine, his mind fully engaged in something he hadn't allowed himself to think about in so long a future. The shop owner watched him carefully, nodding in approval. After an hour, he clapped a hand on Daniel's shoulder. You're hired. Daniel blinked. Just like that? The older man grinned. I don't need to see a resume to know when a man knows what he's doing. A wave of relief and gratitude washed over Daniel. By the time he left the shop that evening, he had a job, a home, and a reason to wake up the next morning with hope. As he walked back to his apartment, his phone buzzed again. Karoline, how'd it go? Daniel smiled and typed back. Daniel, first day is tomorrow. Looks like I have a job again. A moment later, the response came. Karoline, I never had a doubt. Daniel stood outside his apartment, staring at the key in his hand. For so long, he had believed he had to do it all alone, that he had to struggle in silence, because that's just the way life worked. But now, he knew better. Sometimes, all it takes is one person paying attention. And because Karoline had paid attention, his life had changed forever. The next morning, Daniel woke up before sunrise. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. For the first time in a long time, he had somewhere to be, something to look forward to. He showered, shaved, and pulled on a fresh set of clothes, nothing fancy, just a sturdy pair of jeans and a work shirt that felt right. As he laced up his boots, he realized how different it felt to be getting ready for a real job instead of just another shift behind the wheel. By the time he stepped out onto the street, the air was crisp, and the city was slowly waking up around him. The repair shop was only a short walk away, and as Daniel made his way down the sidewalk, he took in his surroundings with fresh eyes. The coffee shop on the corner, the newspaper stand with the old man who greeted customers with a nod, things he had passed by 100 times before but never really seen. Now everything felt different. When he arrived at the shop, the owner, Frank, was already there, rolling up the garage door. "You're early," Frank said, raising an eyebrow. Daniel smirked. "Figured I'd start off on the right foot." Frank chuckled. "I like that. Come on, let's get to work." The day flew by faster than Daniel expected. The familiar rhythm of the shop, the scent of motor oil, the sound of tools clicking into place, it all felt natural, like stepping back into a life he had almost forgotten. By noon, he was elbow deep in an engine rebuild, grease smeared on his hands, sweat forming on his brow. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't tired in the way he had been before. This wasn't exhaustion. This was purpose. During lunch, Frank leaned against the workbench and studied him for a moment. "You know," he said, chewing on a toothpick, "when Karoline called me about you, I wasn't sure what to expect. People fall on hard times all the time, but not everyone gets back up." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, thinking about that for a second. "I didn't think I would," he admitted. "Not for a long time." Frank nodded. "But you did." He crossed his arms. "I've seen plenty of guys who let life knock them down and stay there. You're not one of them." Daniel exhaled, letting those words sink in. He had spent so much time feeling like he was barely holding on, like his past defined him. But now, here he was working, rebuilding, moving forward. That evening, after a full day at the shop, Daniel walked home. His feet ached, his arms were sore, but for the first time in months, it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from earning something real. When he stepped inside his apartment, he let out a slow breath, feeling the warmth of the space around him. He had a home. He had a job. He had a future. And he wasn't alone. His phone buzzed on the table. "Karoline, how was the first day?" Daniel smiled, shaking his head. He picked up the phone and typed back. "Daniel, hard work, sore muscles, grease everywhere, best day I've had in a long time." A moment later, her response came. "Karoline, told you so." Daniel chuckled, setting his phone down. For the first time in a long time, he didn't just feel like he was getting through the day. He felt like he was living again. And something told him this was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Daniel settled into his new life, slowly adjusting to a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Each morning, he woke up early, made coffee in his own kitchen, and walked to the repair shop, breathing in the crisp morning air with a sense of purpose. The work was demanding, but it was the kind of challenge he welcomed. With every engine he fixed, every problem he solved, he felt a piece of himself returning the man he used to be before life knocked him down. Frank, the shop owner, had quickly taken a liking to him. Though he was tough and straightforward, he treated Daniel like an equal, not a man who had lost everything and was starting over. One afternoon, as Daniel tightened the last bolt on a transmission, Frank leaned against the tool bench, watching him. "You've got good hands," Frank said. "Steady, like you never left the business." Daniel wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve and exhaled. "Feels good to be back." Frank studied him for a moment. "Ever thought about opening up your own shop again?" Daniel hesitated. The thought had crossed his mind fleeting, like a distant dream. But starting over had seemed impossible for so long that he hadn't dared to imagine it as a real possibility. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "It took everything out of me last time. Not sure I have it in me to build from scratch again." Frank nodded slowly. "That's fair. But you're not the same guy you were back then." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Frank shrugged. "Back then, you were working for survival. Now, you've got something different. You've got people in your corner." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. For so long, he had carried everything alone. His wife's illness, the financial struggles, losing his home, he had taken it all on his shoulders, never expecting anyone to step in. But now, things were different. He had a roof over his head, a steady paycheck, and someone who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. That night, as he sat in his apartment staring at the ceiling, the thought wouldn't leave his mind. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe it was time to start thinking about more than just getting by. Maybe it was time to start dreaming again. His phone buzzed. "Karoline, how's work?" Daniel smirked and typed back. "Daniel, Frank thinks I should open my own shop one day." A moment passed before her response came. "Karoline, he's right. You should." Daniel exhaled. She believed in him. And for the first time, he was starting to believe in himself, too. The idea of reopening his own repair shop lingered in Daniel's mind for days. It followed him as he worked under the hood of a car, as he walked home in the evening, as he brewed his morning coffee. It had been years since he had allowed himself to think beyond the next paycheck, beyond just making it through another day. But now, with each passing moment, the thought felt less like a fantasy and more like a possibility. One evening, as he locked up the shop, Frank called out from the garage. "Hey, before you head out, come inside for a second." Daniel stepped back into the dimly lit workspace, wiping his hands on a rag. Frank was sitting at his desk, a worn-out ledger open in front of him. He gestured for Daniel to take a seat. "I've been thinking," Frank said, tapping his fingers against the desk. "I'm not getting any younger. Been running this place for over 30 years. And to be honest, I don't want to be under a car when I'm 70. Daniel furrowed his brows. "What are you saying?" Frank leaned back, studying him. "I'm saying I don't want to sell this shop to some big corporation that'll gut it and turn it into another soulless chain. I'd rather leave it to someone who actually gives a damn." Daniel stared at him. "You're serious?" Frank nodded. "I've watched you work. I've seen how you talk to customers, how you care about the job. You remind me of myself when I started. If you want it, I'd be willing to work something out. Not a handout, you'll buy it from me, fair and square. But I'd give you time, help you transition, make sure you succeed." Daniel's heart pounded. This was it, the kind of opportunity he had convinced himself would never come again. He leaned forward, running a hand through his hair. "Frank, I don't know what to say." Frank smirked. "Say you'll think about it, that's all." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'll think about it." That night, he sat in his apartment, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. Could he really do this? His phone buzzed, breaking him from his thoughts. "Karoline, how was work today?" He hesitated for a moment, then typed back. "Daniel, Frank wants me to take over the shop." This time, the dots appeared instantly. "Karoline, and what do you want?" Daniel exhaled, staring at the screen. For so long, he had been living in survival mode, never daring to ask himself that question. But now, for the first time in a long time, he actually had an answer. "Daniel, I think I want this." Karoline's response came immediately. "Karoline, then go get it." Daniel put the phone down, his chest tightening with emotion. He had spent so long believing his best days were behind him. But now, standing at the edge of something new, he realized the truth his best days were just beginning. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a new kind of energy. He wasn't just getting up for work, he was getting up for his future. As he walked to the shop, the city felt different. The same streets, the same coffee shop on the corner, the same people rushing to their jobs, but now he wasn't just passing through. For the first time in years, he felt like he was building something real again. When he arrived, Frank was already there, leaning against a workbench with his usual morning coffee. Daniel took a deep breath. "I want to do it." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Do what?" Daniel smirked. "Take over the shop." Frank grinned. "Took you long enough." They spent the rest of the morning going over the details. Frank laid out a plan. Daniel would start learning the business side of things while continuing to work on cars. Over time, Frank would slowly hand over operations, making sure Daniel knew everything from ordering parts to handling payroll to building relationships with customers. "It won't be easy," Frank warned, tapping a wrench against the counter. "Running a business is more than just fixing cars. But if you put in the work, this place will be yours." Daniel nodded. "I'm ready." And for the first time in a long time, he actually believed it. Weeks passed, then months. Daniel's days were longer, no early mornings, late nights, but the exhaustion that had once weighed him down felt different now. It was the kind of tired that came with progress, not survival. He wasn't just fixing cars. He was learning how to run a business, how to manage employees, how to make sure the shop thrived. And through it all, Karoline kept checking in. "Karoline, how's the shop?" Daniel, "Busy, exhausted, learning more than I ever thought I could." Karoline, "Sounds like progress." Daniel, "Yeah, I think it is." One afternoon, as Daniel tightened the last bolt on a repair job, Frank called him into the office. "I've been thinking," Frank said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. Daniel picked it up. His breath caught. It was the official ownership transfer agreement. "This shop is ready for you," Frank said, "and so are you." Daniel stared at the paper. The weight of ITOF, everything settled over him. This wasn't just a shop. It was a second chance. A new beginning. He swallowed hard. "Frank, I don't know how to thank you." Frank chuckled. "You already did. You worked for it." That night, as Daniel locked up the shop that was now his, took a deep breath, letting it all sink in. His phone buzzed. "Karoline, so what's next, business owner?" Daniel smiled, staring up at the stars. "Daniel, now I build something great." As he slipped the keys into his pocket, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't just starting over. He was finally moving forward. Over the next few months, Daniel threw himself into his work like never before. Owning the shop wasn't just about fixing cars anymore. It was about building something lasting, something he could be proud of. He hired a small team, carefully choosing mechanics who shared his values: hard work, honesty, and dedication. He built relationships with suppliers, negotiated fair prices, and even set up a system to help struggling customers with flexible payment plans. Slowly but surely, the shop wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. One evening, as he closed up, Daniel stood outside for a moment, staring at the sign above the garage. It now had a new name: Morales Auto Repair. His name? His legacy? The sound of a car pulling up made him turn. He smiled as Karoline stepped out, her eyes scanning the shop before landing on him. "Nice sign," she said, nodding in approval. Daniel chuckled. "Figured it was time to put my name on something again." She glanced around. "You did it. You actually did it. Echt." Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I guess I did." Karoline smirked. "I knew you would." He studied her for a moment, shaking his head in amusement. "You always believed in me, didn't you?" She crossed her arms. "Some people just need someone to remind them of what they're capable of." Daniel let those words settle for a second. Then, with a grin, he motioned toward the open garage door. "Want to see the place?" Karoline laughed. "I thought you'd never ask." He led her inside, showing her the new lifts. the updated tools, even the office where he handled paperwork, a part of the job he was still getting used to. As they walked, Daniel's mind drifted back to the first time she had handed him that envelope, the first time he had stepped into his apartment, the first time he had realized that life wasn't over, it was just changing. And now? Now he wasn't just surviving, he was building. For the first time in years, he had a future. And it had all started with one person noticing. As they stepped outside, Karoline looked at him thoughtfully. "So, what's next for Morales Auto Repair?" Daniel smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep, hard-earned satisfaction. "Now," he said, glancing back at the shop, at the life he had rebuilt, "now I make sure no one else has to start over alone." Karoline nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "Sounds like a plan." As she got into her car and drove away, Daniel stood there for a moment, letting the night air fill his lungs. He had started with nothing. And now? Now, he had everything that mattered. And for the first time in a long time, he knew this was just the beginning. The end.